What would make two wild wolves walk through a snowstorm, just to stand quietly at a stranger's door? Not teeth bared, not hunting, just waiting. Harold Whitaker had spent years alone in a cabin deep in the Alaskan woods. No neighbors, no visitors, just wind, fire, and memory. But one night, that silence broke, with a sound no one expects out here. And what happened next didn't just challenge everything he thought he knew about wild animals, it changed the rhythm of his life. In a part of Alaska where the wind speaks louder than people, Harold Whitaker, 71, had spent the last 13 winters mostly in silence. His cabin, half swallowed by pines and snowdrifts, had grown old with him, creaking in the same places his knees now did. He chopped wood slowly these days, took his coffee black, didn't talk much, not because he had nothing to say, but because no one was around to hear it. That evening, the snow had come early, thick, heavy. It blanketed everything in a way that made the world feel sealed off, as if someone had pressed pause on life outside. Harold sat by the fire, a quilt over his legs, reading a faded newspaper from 3 days ago. He didn't expect anything to happen. At his age, most things that came knocking weren't good, so when he heard the sound, a soft scuff, like claws on wood, he froze. He waited, thinking maybe it was the wind shifting a branch, but then came another noise. A low, careful shuffle. Then something heavier, a paw against his porch. Harold stood up slowly, letting the quilt fall to the floor. He didn't grab his rifle. Something in the quiet told him not to. When he opened the door, just a few inches, cold air rushed in like a warning, and there they were. Two wolves, huddled together, not more than 6 feet from him. Their coats were clumped with ice, ribs clearly visible beneath fur stretched too thin. One had a fresh cut across its flank, frozen blood staining the white snow dark. The other stood shakily, barely holding its weight. But what stopped Harold wasn't the injuries. It was their eyes. They weren't wild. They were pleading. There was no growling, no challenge. Just a strange, terrible calm. The kind of calm you only see in things that have run out of strength to be afraid. Harold had seen it once before, in his wife's eyes, on the last morning she could sit up in bed. He stood there for a long while, the cold biting his fingertips. The wolves didn't move. He whispered, more to himself than to them, "What the hell happened to you two?" Maybe they had been separated from their pack. Maybe they were dying. Or maybe, just maybe, some old part of their instincts still recognized a fire's warmth, even if it lived inside 4 wooden walls. Harold knew better, but he also knew what it felt like to need help and not know where to ask. He opened the door wider. The wolves didn't lunge. They didn't even flinch. They walked in like shadows, one limping, one almost collapsing, until they reached the hearth. Harold pointed, not quite sure why. "You stay there. That's all I got." He watched them settle, first wary, then exhausted. The larger one tucked its muzzle under the other's chin. They didn't take their eyes off him. He put another log on the fire, then returned to his chair. The cabin was warmer now, but not because of the flames. He sat back, hands folded in his lap, eyes on the two creatures breathing steady on his floor. And for the first time in years, Harold Whitaker didn't feel like the only living thing in that house. Morning in the Alaskan forest doesn't begin with light. It begins with creaks of wood, the hiss of a fading fire, and the deep hush of snowfall pressing in from all sides. Harold woke before dawn, like he always did. But today, something was different. He wasn't alone. Across the room, beside the old cast-iron stove, the two wolves still lay motionless. But now that he could see them better, Harold noticed the wound. The smaller one had a gash stretching along its hind leg, deep, crusted, red at the edges. Harold crouched down slowly, his joints stiff, movement careful. He didn't reach out, he just looked. The injured wolf raised its head and met his eyes, tired but not aggressive. He spoke softly without thinking. "That's gotta hurt." He didn't have veterinary supplies, just the basics. Clean cloth, rubbing alcohol, gauze. Things he kept around in case he slipped on the steps or cut himself, splitting kindling. He gathered what he could and came back with a basin of warm water. The other wolf growled low, barely a warning, but didn't move. Harold knelt beside the injured one. His hands shook a little, not from fear, from age. But he moved with the same steadiness he'd once used to dress his wife's foot, back when her circulation had started to fail. Same tools, same care. The wolf didn't flinch. It winced, but didn't pull away. Harold cleaned the wound, patted it dry and wrapped it. No dramatic moment. Just a quiet agreement between two old creatures who knew pain too well to make a fuss about it. When he was done, he sat back on his heels and let out a slow breath. "You'll be all right," he murmured. "Just need time. We both do." The cabin was still, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from absence but from acceptance. He stood, returned to the kitchen, and opened a can of stew beef. He heated it gently, scooping out the broth and meat, placing it in an old metal bowl he used for dog food back when Daisy was alive. He slid it across the floor. Neither wolf pounced. They approached it slowly, like animals who'd learned too often that food came with a cost. But they ate. That afternoon, Harold didn't turn on the radio. He didn't read the paper. He just sat with them. Let them exist in his space. He didn't pet them, didn't name them. Just watched over them, like he used to watch the tree line for signs of his grandkids visiting during summers that no longer came. In the quiet of that long day, something else began to form. Not trust, not yet, but an understanding. They were no longer visitors, they were company. And for Harold, who hadn't had a conversation in weeks, that was enough. By the end of the week, Harold Whitaker had stopped counting the days. Time no longer arrived in calendar pages or radio bulletins. It moved with smaller signals now. The steady crackle of the stove, the soft padding of paws across wood, the way light filtered through frost on the windows, painting quiet stories on the walls. The wolves hadn't left. They didn't pace. They didn't scratch to get out. They didn't even howl, not once. They simply stayed, lying curled near the heat source, dozing, alert, resting again. They moved only when they had to. There was no fear anymore, only caution, and a kind of unspoken treaty that said, "We don't understand each other, but we mean no harm." That was enough. Harold never named them. To do so felt wrong. Names were for things you wanted to claim. These animals weren't his, they weren't anyone's, but they were here, and that meant something. The cabin had changed, not in appearance, but in energy. Where once every creak reminded Harold of solitude, now it held a different weight. Presence, rhythm, company. He found himself waking early, not out of habit, but because there was a reason to. He chopped wood with care, not because he needed more heat, but because he'd started preparing extra for the nights when their breathing deepened, when their bodies needed it most. Some days the wolves slept through the sunrise. Other days, they stood at the window, watching the snow drift. Harold did the same. They never stood side by side, but they often watched the same thing. Still, quiet, thoughtful. There was no moment of bonding, no dramatic turning point, just accumulated trust, slow like thawing ice. One afternoon, as Harold stirred soup on the stove, he heard a soft sound behind him, claws on floorboards, slow and even. He turned to see the larger wolf standing just a few feet away, watching. Not approaching. Just there. Harold didn't speak. He nodded. The wolf blinked slowly, then walked to the corner and laid back down. It struck Harold then, not how strange it was to have wolves in his home, but how not strange it had begun to feel. He remembered something his wife once said during a camping trip, decades ago. She'd woken early to watch a fox hunt near their tent. Later, over coffee, she'd told him, "You know, the forest doesn't mind us being here. It just waits to see if we'll act like we belong." And now, somehow, he felt the same inside his own walls. The radio hadn't been turned on in 5 days. Not because he forgot, but because the news had nothing to say that these creatures hadn't already reminded him. He didn't need updates from town. He didn't need talk. What he needed, what he'd quietly longed for without ever saying, was exactly what had arrived. Not words, not answers. Just something alive that didn't need fixing, explaining, or enduring. And for a man who had gotten used to listening to the refrigerator hum just to fill the room, the sound of 2 steady heartbeats near the fire was more than background noise. It was a reason to stay seated, to keep the kettle warm, to keep the wood dry, to keep going. The knock on the door this time was different. Not claws, not wind. A human knock. Harold didn't move right away. He hadn't heard another voice in over a month. The wolves stirred, alert but not afraid. The injured one lifted its head, ears twitching. Harold stood, glanced at them once, then opened the door. Standing in the snow was a woman, bundled tightly in a navy parka, snow up to her knees, her breath fogging the air with every exhale. In her gloved hands, she held a GPS tracker and a pair of binoculars. Her voice, when it came, was calm but urgent. "You're Harold Whitaker, right? I'm Dr. Kara Linwood. I've been tracking 2 wolves since the last storm. Their collars stopped signaling 4 days ago. Then the signal came from your ridge." Harold stepped aside. "They're in here," he said, like he was talking about old friends. "Been here a while." She entered slowly, brushing snow off her sleeves. The heat hit her face and her eyes adjusted to the dim light of the cabin. Then she saw them. She didn't speak, just stood there, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, the way someone might pause before stepping into sacred ground. The wolves didn't growl, didn't shift, they simply watched her. After a moment, Kara crouched, careful, measured. "They're alive," she whispered. "I can't believe it. After that blizzard, I thought—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. She stood, removed her gloves, and looked at Harold, not as a scientist but as someone trying to understand what she was seeing. They should have run. Wolves don't linger in human homes, even when injured. Harold poured her a mug of coffee. "They didn't seem to know that?" She smiled faintly. "You patched one of them up?" "Did what I could." "They let you?" "They didn't stop me." Kara looked at the bandaged leg, then at Harold, her expression caught between amazement and something softer, respect. "These wolves are part of a monitored pack from Denali Ridge. The storm scattered them. We've been trying to locate survivors. Most don't come back from weather like that." She paused, lowering her voice. "But I've never seen them act like this around a human." Harold didn't answer. There was nothing to explain. What had happened in this cabin wasn't science, it was proximity, built day by day. Trust, layered like snow, thin, fragile, but quietly strong. Kara turned back to the wolves. "They'll need full medical checks. We can transport them to the wildlife center once the road clears." Harold nodded, slow and steady. "You do what you need." She took another sip of coffee, eyes still on the pair lying by the stove. "You saved them," she said, "whether you meant to or not." Harold shrugged. "They walked in. I just didn't push them out." That night, Kara stayed in the spare room. The storm was returning, and the trail she hiked in on was already gone beneath fresh snow. She called her team on the satellite phone, gave coordinates, and settled in for the night. Harold added extra wood to the stove. The wolves slept like they always had. And for the first time in a long time, Harold wasn't the only one in the house who understood what it meant to be stranded and still stay open. The snow returned that night with the weight of something unfinished. By morning, it had erased all paths, buried the trail Kara had used to find the cabin, swallowed the outlines of trees, flattened everything into a white, endless hush. Kara stood at the window, rubbing her arms through her thick sweater. "We won't get out today," she said quietly. "Maybe not tomorrow either." Harold nodded. He wasn't in a hurry. Neither were the wolves. The cabin became a kind of triage center. Kara moved slowly, checking vitals, logging data into a notebook. Harold kept the fire steady and the stew warm. They didn't talk much, but they worked in sync, 2 people who understood that when life takes shelter, you keep it safe, simple, and warm. That afternoon, as Harold stepped outside to check the snowdrift height against the shed, something caught his eye near the tree line. Not movement exactly, more like absence. A gap in the monotony of white. He narrowed his eyes, squinted, then he saw it. Another wolf, alone, limping, head low. It wasn't coming toward him, it wasn't even watching. It just stood there, thin, barely upright, as if the effort to exist had become too much. Harold called out, but it didn't react. He walked back inside, boots leaving slow, heavy prints. "There's another one," he said simply. Kara looked up from her notebook. "Where?" "Past the ridge. It's not going to last long." She moved to the window, adjusted the binoculars, and found it almost instantly. "It's one of theirs," she whispered. "It has the same markings." She lowered the binoculars, already reaching for her coat. "If we wait, it'll collapse. If we go now, the storm could turn, but I have to try." Harold didn't hesitate. "I'm coming with you." She opened her mouth to argue, then saw something in his eyes. Not stubbornness, conviction. They packed quickly. Thermal blankets, a rope, the sled Harold used to haul wood, a field kit from Kara's backpack. The wind had picked up again, the kind that cuts sideways and steals your breath. Every step into the forest was work. The snow clung heavy to their legs. Visibility dropped with each gust, but they kept going. And when they reached the wolf, it didn't run, didn't move. Kara knelt first. "She's in shock," she murmured. Dehydrated, hypothermic. Harold wrapped the blanket around the animal, surprised at how light she felt. Bones. Fur. Not much more. Together they eased her onto the sled, tied her gently in place, and turned back toward the cabin. It took longer to return. The storm thickened. The world closed in. But they didn't stop. When they finally reached the door, Harold opened it, and the other two wolves were already standing, ears up, tails still, bodies tense. Then something remarkable happened. As the sled slid over the threshold and the third wolf was pulled inside, the room changed. The injured pair rose, approached slowly, and then, so naturally it seemed rehearsed, they touched noses. No growls, no snaps, just soft, low whines. One nuzzled the newcomer's neck, the other curled its body against hers. They weren't just a pack, they were family. Kara stood frozen, hand still on the sled rope. Harold stepped back, voice quiet. They knew she was out there. Kara didn't speak, she didn't have to. The three wolves huddled together by the fire, their bodies intertwined, not in fear, but in relief. And Harold, who had once believed his winters would be marked only by loss, felt something shift. This wasn't rescue, it was reunion. The storm didn't break that night. It softened, but only enough to remind them it was still there. Snow pressed against the windows in thick waves, muffling every sound except for the occasional pop from the stove and the slow, steady breathing of the wolves, now curled together on the floor. Harold barely slept. Not from worry, from something deeper, a quiet readiness. At first light, he went outside to check the path they had used the day before. The trail had vanished, buried under another foot of snow. But the wind had eased, and the sky carried a softer tone, like the forest itself had exhaled. Inside, Kara prepped supplies. They're stable, she said, nodding toward the wolves. But they need better care than we can give here. IV fluids, X-rays, antibiotics. I called my team, the road crews clearing the last 10 miles. Harold leaned against the doorway. They can handle the trip? They'll have to. It's their best chance. A few hours later, the sound of an engine broke the silence. Distant at first, then closer, until a snowmobile crested the far ridge, followed by a small transport sled. A man with a thick beard and reflective vest stepped off and nodded at Kara. Name's Vince, Wildlife Recovery Unit. Kara explained the situation in short, clipped sentences. Vince listened, then turned to Harold. You really kept them alive in here? Harold shrugged. I kept the fire going. They did the rest. The next hour passed in practiced movements. Soft cloth muzzles, insulated carriers, vitals checked and logged. The wolves didn't resist. They moved slowly, deliberately, each step guided more by fatigue than fear. But when the third wolf, still weak, was lifted onto the sled, the other two immediately followed, lying beside her, heads low, tails still. They didn't fight the straps, didn't panic. It wasn't submission, it was trust. Harold stood back, hands in his pockets. The cabin suddenly felt larger, emptier, but not hollow. Not anymore. Kara turned to him, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. You could come with us, see the center, watch their recovery. Harold shook his head. Not yet. She paused. You sure? I'm sure, he said gently. They're on their way to healing, so am I. Just at a different pace. Vince climbed onto the snowmobile. Kara followed. Before leaving, she pressed a card into Harold's hand. I'll send updates. Photos, if you'd like. You did more than help them survive. Harold looked at the card, then up at her. I know what it feels like to be lost, he said quietly, and I know what it means when someone doesn't give up on you. Kara didn't reply. She didn't need to. The sled started forward. The snow cracked softly under its runners, and as it disappeared into the trees, Harold stood on his porch, hands bare despite the cold. Inside, the fire still burned. Outside, the silence returned. But it was no longer lonely. It was simply quiet. And that, for Harold Whitaker, was enough. They left just before noon, when the sun was barely high enough to cast a shadow. Harold watched from the porch as the sled moved slow but sure over the snow-covered path. 3 wolves tucked in securely under thick canvas, and Kara riding behind, her gloved hand lifting once in quiet farewell. He didn't wave back, not because he didn't feel it, but because some moments aren't meant for gestures. They're meant for stillness. As the snowmobile disappeared behind the trees, swallowed by the pines in silence, Harold stood there for a while longer. The air bit gently at his cheeks. The wind curled around the cabin, testing the cracks between the boards like it always did. Only now, it felt less like a force to endure, and more like something familiar, something known. When he stepped back inside, the cabin felt larger. Not because anything had changed. The chair was still angled toward the fire, the kettle still warm. The folded towels where the wolves had slept were still pressed slightly down in the middle, like they had only just gotten up and would return any minute. But they wouldn't. He knew that. Still, he didn't clear the space. He didn't move the towels. He didn't straighten the rug. Some things weren't mess. They were memory. And memory wasn't meant to be erased. The fire popped gently as he sat down. No radio, no clock ticking, just the sounds of a house returning to itself, slower now and softer. He made tea. Out of habit, he brought down 2 mugs from the shelf. He hesitated for a second, then put one away. Small moments like that, they carried more weight than grief ever shouted. That evening, as dusk settled in with its usual blue hush, Harold opened the drawer near the fireplace. Inside was an old cigar box where he kept things that didn't belong anywhere else. A postcard from his brother, a photo of his wife on their last camping trip, a menu from a diner that no longer existed. He placed something new inside, a slip of paper Kara had left with her phone number, an email, and 3 words scribbled quickly in the corner. "I'll send updates." And she did. 3 days later, a letter came, postmarked from the Wildlife Center. Inside was a photo. Simple, unframed. The 3 wolves were huddled together inside a hay-lined recovery enclosure. One was sitting up, alert. Another had its head resting on the third's back. Their eyes weren't frightened. They weren't wild either. They were steady. Written beneath the photo in Kara's clean handwriting was a short note. "They're eating well, healing faster than expected, still sleeping close to each other every night. I thought you should see." Harold stared at it for a long time. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But he reached across the table, picked up the photo and placed it in a small frame he hadn't used in years. It sat beside the woodpile, angled toward the stove. A small reminder that what had happened wasn't just unusual. It had been real. Later that night, he lit the fire early, not because it was cold, but because the silence asked for it. The flames rose slowly, licking the edge of the log with a sound like breathing. He sat back in his chair, wrapped in the same blanket he'd used every winter for 20 years, and looked around his home. Everything was quiet again. But it wasn't the same quiet. It was a quiet that held memory, that bore witness, that didn't need to speak to be felt. And for the first time in many winters, Harold didn't feel like the last page of a book. He felt like a chapter that had finally turned. Winter passed the way it always did in Alaska, slow at first, then all at once. One morning the snow didn't come. The next, birds returned to the tree line. The air began to smell like damp pine instead of cold ash. Harold didn't mark the change with a calendar. He marked it by the sound of melting icicles, the way his boots no longer crunched, and the return of light through the eastern window just a little earlier each day. The cabin remained the same. But he hadn't. The days no longer stretched endlessly. They had shape now, purpose. He rose early not out of routine, but out of quiet anticipation. He still made tea, still fed the birds, still chopped firewood when the pile got low. But now, each act felt different, not mechanical, intentional. Some evenings he'd sit by the stove and read Kara's updates, short, factual, but always ending with a small detail that made him pause. They started hunting together again. They stay close to the boundary, but don't try to leave it. They move as a unit, like they always had. Sometimes she included photos, blurry ones, taken from a distance. But Harold didn't need clarity. He could tell who was who just by posture, by stance. The one with the healed legs still walked slightly left. The smallest one always brought up the rear. He never wrote back. He didn't need to. Their survival was answer enough. Spring brought more than thaw. It brought rhythm. Harold cleared out the shed, repaired a cracked window, repainted the porch rail, not because anyone was visiting, but because he wanted things to be ready, just in case. He kept the 3 folded towels in a basket near the hearth, washed, dried, set aside like you do for guests who might never arrive, but who once had without warning and left something behind. One morning, while clearing debris near the woodpile, he found fresh tracks. Not deer, not rabbit, paw prints, deep, heavy. Heading toward the trees, he didn't follow them. He didn't need to. He stood for a moment, hand resting on the handle of the axe, eyes tracing the prints until they vanished into the forest's edge. Then he smiled. Not wide, not long, just enough. Night, as the sun dipped low and orange light bled into the windows, Harold added an extra log to the fire. Not because it was cold, but because warmth, when shared once, asks to be kept alive. And even now, alone in that cabin, he never sat with his back to the door. He kept a space near the fire clear, just in case. Not for the wolves, but for whatever came next. If you've ever been told you were too old to make a difference, remember this. Some of the most powerful moments in life don't come with noise. They come with a quiet knock and a choice to open the door. Type 1, if you've ever felt like the later years of life were just waiting for something to end. Type 2, if you believe quiet kindness still has the power to change everything. And if this story touched something in you, consider subscribing. Not for the sake of a channel, but as a quiet reminder. As long as someone keeps the fire lit, there's still hope to come home to.